The elevator doors opened on the 34th floor, and Marcus Hale stepped out carrying a USB drive, a printed report in a manila folder, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the parking garage and the lobby. He had not bought the coffee for the taste. He had bought it because his hands needed something to hold. The hallway was the kind that exists only in buildings built to make people feel small before they even reach the room. The carpet was a deep charcoal gray. The walls were glass on one side, floor to ceiling, looking out over a city that was still waking up, the kind of view that costs money just to stand near. There were no photographs on the walls, no plants, no softness of any kind, just clean lines, expensive silence, and the faint hum of climate control keeping the air at a temperature that said, "We are in control of everything here, including the weather." Marcus walked slowly, not because he was nervous, because he had learned, over many years and many rooms like this one, that the way a man walks into a space tells that space something about him before he opens his mouth, and Marcus had always believed in letting the room underestimate him first. He was 44 years old. He was wearing a navy blazer he had dry cleaned the week before, dark trousers, and shoes that were not expensive but were very clean. His hair was going gray at the temples, not in the distinguished way that gets called silver in magazine profiles, but in the quiet, unannounced way of a man who stopped thinking about it because other things became more important. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident when Lily was 5, and he had tried to teach her to ride by running alongside her and not watching where he was going. She had been fine. He had not. He reached the boardroom. Through the glass wall he could already see them. 8 people arranged around an oval table that probably cost more than his car. Not his current car, his car from before. The table was pale oak or pale ash or one of those pale woods that looks like it was chosen by someone who wanted beauty without warmth. There were water glasses. There were legal pads with the company logo printed at the top. There were laptops open and glowing, because this was the kind of room where people always needed to look busy. At the head of the table, not the geographic head, but the gravitational one, the seat that everything else orbited, sat Richard Calloway. Marcus had seen photographs. The photographs had not prepared him. Calloway was 51, broad-shouldered in a way that suggested he had once been athletic and had let the athleticism slowly convert itself into authority. His suit was dark and fitted and the kind of expensive that announces itself by pretending not to. He had the face of a man who had been told he was right so many times that being wrong had become a theoretical concept, something that happened to other people in other industries in other decades. His eyes were already on his phone when Marcus pushed open the door. The room glanced up. Calloway did not. "Mr. Hale." It was Denise who said it, Calloway's assistant, standing near the credenza along the sidewall. She was somewhere in her early 40s, with the specific posture of someone who had learned to be invisible in rooms like this one. Her voice was professionally warm, the kind of warm that has been carefully maintained despite everything. "Please come in. We're just getting started." Marcus nodded to her. He set his folder on the table. He found the open laptop port and inserted his USB drive. He pulled up his first slide, a clean, single-color header slide that said, "Southeast Distribution Network, Efficiency Review, M. Hale Consulting." He cleared his throat softly. "Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Marcus Hale, and I've spent the last 3 weeks conducting a full audit of your—" "How long is this?" The voice came from the head of the table. Calloway had still not looked up from his phone. The room went the specific kind of still that happens when someone with power speaks in a register that makes clear they are not asking a question so much as issuing a verdict with a question mark attached to it for the sake of appearances. Marcus paused. "The presentation is approximately, I was told, 90 minutes. Now Calloway looked up. His eyes moved to Marcus the way a man's eyes move to a minor inconvenience. A light that won't stop blinking, a sound from another room. Not hostile exactly. Something worse than hostile. Indifferent. "I want to be honest with you, Mr." He glanced at the folder. "Hale. I was told this was worth 90 minutes. He set his phone face down on the table, which in this context was not a gesture of attention but a gesture of patience being visibly rationed. "I'm not sure it's worth 9. He said it conversationally. That was the part that landed hardest. Not the content of it, but the tone. The tone of a man who has dismissed people so many times that it has stopped requiring any particular effort. The tone of someone for whom this was not an event. It was a Tuesday. A board member near the middle of the table, younger, with the carefully neutral expression of someone calculating how to react, glanced down at his legal pad. Another reached for his water glass. Someone's laptop screen shifted from whatever it had been showing to something that required sudden, intense focus. Denise, by the credenza, looked at a spot on the wall just above Marcus's left shoulder. Marcus stood at the front of the room. He did not look away from Calloway. He did not color. He did not do the thing that the room was perhaps waiting for him to do. The small collapse, the apologetic adjustment of posture, the unconscious reach towards self-erasure that happens when a person of less institutional power is made to feel, publicly, that they are taking up space they haven't earned. He stood the way he always stood. The way he stood in Lily's school gymnasium during her winter recital, in the third row, surrounded by couples, completely alone, completely still, watching his daughter sing a song she had practiced 17 times in their kitchen while he washed the dinner dishes and called out corrections she ignored until they weren't wrong anymore. He reached down and picked up the manila folder. He opened it to the first page. He looked up. "I understand," he said. His voice was quiet. Not wounded quiet, the other kind. The kind that has learned the difference between what deserves a reaction and what deserves a response. "Then I'll be efficient." He clicked to his second slide. The room watched him. Calloway picked his phone back up. Not aggressively, just with the comfortable ease of a man who had made his point and considered the matter settled. His thumb moved across the screen. He was already somewhere else. Already in the next meeting, the next decision, the next thing that mattered more than the man standing at the front of the room with clean shoes and a cold coffee and 11 years of knowledge that no one in this building knew he was carrying. The city blinked outside the glass wall. Marcus looked at his slide. And then he began. Not because the room deserved it. Not because Calloway had earned it. Not because anyone had asked for it with anything resembling courtesy or grace or the basic human acknowledgement that the person standing before them had driven 40 minutes, printed 22 pages, and spent 30 evenings in a quiet apartment, after a 9-year-old girl was asleep and her lunch was made and her book bag was packed. Building something that was, whether this room understood it yet or not, exactly what they needed. He began because that was what he did. Because Lily had a field trip to Washington, D.C. and the deadline was Friday. Because the dashboard of his Camry had a crack in it shaped like a river. And over it, placed there by small careful hands on a Sunday afternoon, was a sticker of a yellow sun. Because some people show you who they are by how loud they are in a room. And some people show you by what they do when the room decides they aren't worth the silence. Marcus Hale clicked to slide 3. And somewhere in the back of the room, almost imperceptibly, a board member leaned forward. There is a particular kind of man that the world has never learned to see coming. Not because he hides. Not because he is shy or broken or defeated. But because he made a choice somewhere along the way, a quiet, uncelebrated, deeply consequential choice, to stop needing to be seen and start needing to be useful. The world mistakes this for smallness. It is not smallness. It is a form of discipline so complete that it has become invisible, the way the strongest load-bearing walls in a building are always the ones behind the drywall, never the ones you admire in the photographs. Marcus Hale was that kind of man. He had not always been. At 31, he had been the kind of person that rooms noticed. Not in the loud way, not in the way of men who fill spaces with noise and call it personality, but in the way of someone whose mind worked visibly, whose questions were always the right ones, whose presence in a meeting had a way of making other people feel like the conversation had finally, quietly, arrived somewhere worth being. He had been sharp in the way that takes years to cultivate and a specific kind of hunger to maintain. He had cared about his career the way young people care about things when they still believe that caring hard enough is the same as controlling outcomes. He had met Claire at a logistics conference in Atlanta. She was funny in a dry, sideways way that caught him off guard, because he had been expecting the conference to be exactly what it looked like. Fluorescent lights and laminated name tags, and she had been something else entirely. They were married inside 2 years. They were, for a while, genuinely happy in the way that is easy to overlook until it's gone. The happiness of two people who have found a rhythm together, who have built a set of inside references and private jokes and small domestic rituals that make ordinary evenings feel like enough. Lily was born when Marcus was 34. He remembered sitting in the hospital corridor while Claire slept, holding his daughter for the first time in a chair beside the window, the city orange and dark below them, and thinking, with a clarity so complete it almost frightened him, that every ambition he had ever carried felt suddenly like it belonged to a slightly younger man who had not yet understood what mattered. He did not abandon his ambitions. He reorganized them. He put them in a different order. Claire left when Lily was 3. There was no single event. That was the part Marcus had spent the most time with in the years since, the absence of a single clean cause, the thing you could point to and say there, that is where it broke. It didn't break that way. It dissolved. Slowly, the way a tide pulls sand, in increments too small to catch, until one morning there is simply less shore than there used to be. She was unhappy in a way that had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with herself, and she left to find out whether a different life would fit her better. She did not send a forwarding address. She sent a lawyer. Lily had asked for her mother for a while, and then she had stopped asking, the way children eventually stop asking for things they have understood, in their quiet animal way, are not coming. Marcus did not let himself grieve in front of her. He grieved in the car. In parking lots mostly, the specific privacy of a man sitting in a vehicle with the engine off, somewhere between one thing and the next, where no one is watching and no one needs anything from you for 3 minutes. He allowed himself those parking lots. He did not allow himself much else. He became, by necessity and then by nature, a man who handled things. He handled the school runs and the pediatric appointments and the parent-teacher evenings attended by couples who looked at him with a mixture of respect and a pity he had learned to ignore. He handled the grocery lists and the permission slips and the Sunday night rituals of packing a lunch that Lily would find in the morning. Always something she liked, always with a small folded note tucked under the sandwich, usually just a drawing, sometimes a word, never anything that required her to feel anything complicated before school. He handled his career in the margins. This was the part that the boardroom would never understand. The part that Calloway, with his 14-hour days and his staff of 40 and his conference rooms and his vision boards and his quarterly retreats, would have no framework for comprehending. Marcus had built his expertise not in the expansive, well-resourced way of men who have institutional backing and professional development budgets and mentors who return their calls. He had built it in the small hours, between bedtime stories and dawn. On a laptop at a kitchen table after Lily's breathing had steadied and her nightlight was doing its slow color rotation across the ceiling of her room. The pale blue, then the soft green, then the yellow he had let her choose herself. He had taught himself in those hours to see inside systems the way other people cannot. Supply chains are, at their core, stories. They are narratives of movement, of things that need to get from one place to another, of the 10,000 decisions and relationships and variables that determine whether that movement is efficient or hemorrhaging. Most people who work in logistics see the individual chapters. Marcus had developed the rare ability to see the whole book. The through line, the structural weakness buried 3 acts in that would eventually make the ending fall apart, the small choice made in chapter 2 that was costing everything by chapter 9. He had developed this ability the same way he had developed everything else in the last 6 years. Out of necessity, in the dark, without applause. He had built a small consulting practice. Not a firm, a practice. Just himself and a website and a professional network cultivated over 15 years that had never entirely gone cold. He took contracts when he could. He turned down travel that would take him away from Lily for more than 2 nights. He was not, by the metrics that the world uses to measure professional success, a successful man. His car had a crack in the dashboard. His apartment had 2 bedrooms and a radiator that made a sound in January that Lily had named Gerald. He wore the same blazer to every professional engagement and kept it clean. But when something was broken, when a company's numbers were bleeding from a wound that no one could locate, when a system had developed an internal contradiction that was quietly dismantling everything above it, they called Marcus Hale. Not first, usually. After the expensive consultants had come and gone. After the restructuring hadn't worked and the new software hadn't helped and the CFO was starting to use words like systemic in a tone that meant I am frightened and I would prefer not to show it. They called Marcus, and he fixed it. Quietly. Completely. Without making anyone feel stupid for not having seen it themselves. Without building a story around his own brilliance. He handed them the answer, explained it clearly, wrote the implementation document and went home. He had been called to Calloway's building because one of the board members, A man named Gerald Fitch, which Lily would have found cosmically significant given the radiator, had worked with Marcus 4 years earlier at a shipping company in Memphis. Fitch had quietly put his name forward. "He's not much to look at," Fitch had apparently said, which Marcus would have found funny if he had known. "But give him 3 weeks and unlimited access to your data, and he'll find whatever you've lost." He had been given 3 weeks. He had been given access, and he had found it. He had found something so clear and so costly and so completely invisible to everyone who had been looking at it for years that he had sat back in his chair at 2:17 in the morning, Lily asleep down the hall, Gerald the radiator clicking softly, and looked at the numbers on his screen for a long time before allowing himself to believe they were real. He had written the summary. He had put it on page 3. He had marked the subject line urgent. He had sent it 3 weeks ago and received no response. And so he had printed 22 pages, cleaned his shoes, dry cleaned his blazer, and driven 40 minutes to a building where the carpet cost more than his monthly rent, to stand at the front of a room and try to give something valuable to people who had already decided, before he opened his mouth, that he was not worth their time. He clicked to slide 3, and he began. Richard Calloway had not always been cruel. This is important to understand. Not because it excuses him. Not because it softens what he did in that room, or what he had done in dozens of rooms before it, to dozens of people who deserved better. But because the most dangerous kind of dismissiveness is not the kind that comes from malice. Malice, at least, requires you to see the other person. It requires you to register their presence, to assign them enough reality to generate a feeling about them. What Calloway had was worse. He had learned not to see certain people at all. He had grown up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the second of 3 sons of a man who had built a regional freight company from a single lease truck and an unshakable certainty that every problem had a solution if you were willing to outwork the problem. His father had been the kind of man who used the word soft as the most damning adjective in his vocabulary, who considered emotional nuance a form of inefficiency, who showed love through provision and expectation and the setting of bars high enough that reaching them felt like an athletic event. Richard had been the one who reached them. His older brother had eventually stopped trying. His younger brother had moved to Oregon and become a landscape architect, which his father had never entirely forgiven. Richard had been the one who stayed. He had taken his father's freight company and, over 14 years, turned it into something his father would not have recognized. A diversified logistics operation with national reach, 43 regional distribution nodes, a tech integration arm, and a valuation that had been cited in 3 separate trade publications in the last 2 years. He had done it through a combination of genuine strategic intelligence, relentless work, and a tolerance for conflict that had, over the years, calcified into something harder and less examined. He was not stupid. This was the essential thing about Richard Calloway that the people he dismissed most needed to understand. It would have been easier if he were stupid. Stupid men are containable. Stupid men are eventually exposed by their stupidity and the system corrects. Calloway was sharp. He could read a balance sheet the way musicians read scores, not note by note but as a whole shape, immediately the problem areas visible before he had finished the page. He could walk into a failing operation and identify the primary dysfunction within a day. He had instincts that had been built through 15 years of being in the room where things actually broke and actually got fixed. The problem was not his intelligence. The problem was the story his intelligence had told him about itself. Somewhere in the long accumulation of being right, of the correct call in 2014 that saved the Memphis hub, of the acquisition in 2017 that everyone said was overpriced and that tripled in value by 2020, of the technology bet in 2019 that his own board had voted against and that he had overridden and that had become the spine of the company's current competitive advantage. Somewhere in all of that, he had made a mistake so quiet and so foundational that no balance sheet could capture it. He had concluded that his ability to see was complete. That if something was important, he would have noticed it. That if someone was brilliant, they would look a certain way, sound a certain way, arrive a certain way. That expertise announced itself through credentials and confidence and the specific social fluency of people who had been educated in the right rooms and had learned to perform capability in the register that he recognized as capable. He had a mental category for people like Marcus Hale. The category was called not quite. Not quite the right presence. Not quite the right credentials. Not quite the right energy. The category was not cruel in Callaway's internal taxonomy. It was efficient. He processed thousands of pieces of information every day. The category was a filter. The filter was, he believed, highly accurate. The filter had never been seriously challenged because the people it filtered out were precisely the people least likely to push back in a language he would hear. He had looked at Marcus's name on the meeting agenda that morning, put there by Gerald Fitch, who Callaway respected but found occasionally impractical in his enthusiasms, and made a decision before the elevator doors opened. The decision was not malicious. It was categorical. Not quite. A freelance consultant with a thin website and a regional reputation. Someone Fitch vouched for, which meant something but not enough. 90 minutes was too long. He had a call with Singapore at noon. He had a board dinner at 7. He had, at any given moment, 17 things that needed his particular intelligence and 0 minutes to spend on something the filter had already processed. He had said what he said. I'm not sure it's worth 9, the way a man empties a glass. Without ceremony. Without particular awareness that the glass had feelings about being emptied. He had picked up his phone. He had moved on. This was the architecture of what Callaway had become. Not a villain in the operatic sense. Not a man who plotted or schemed or wished harm on people below him. Something more mundane and more damaging. A man who had optimized himself so completely for the kind of intelligence that could be measured and validated and rewarded, that he had lost the ability to perceive the kind that couldn't. He could not see Marcus because Marcus didn't fit the image. And he could not question the image because the image had been right too many times. Denise knew this. Denise Chun had worked for Richard Callaway for 6 years, and she had, in that time, developed the specific emotional expertise of someone who spends years in close proximity to a powerful, complicated person, the ability to read him in the way that only people who cannot afford to misread him can. She knew when he was genuinely engaged and when he was performing engagement. She knew when his certainty was real and when it was armor. She knew the sound of him being wrong versus the sound of him being uncertain, which were different sounds and occurred with very different frequencies. She had watched him dismiss Marcus from the moment the name had appeared on the schedule. She had seen the folder. She had actually read the email, the one Marcus had sent 3 weeks ago, subject line marked urgent, because she read everything that came through the executive inbox before it reached Callaway, flagged the important ones, and filtered the rest. She had flagged Marcus's email. She had put it in the Tuesday review stack. Callaway had reviewed that stack in 9 minutes, standing at his desk, and had moved Marcus's summary to a folder called External Consultants, pending which was, in the taxonomy of that inbox, a polite form of permanent silence. She had not known, at the time, what Marcus had found. She did not know until now, watching him stand at the front of the room with his clean shoes and his manila folder, clicking through slides with the unhurried clarity of someone who has spent 30 evenings building something real. She did not know until now that she had flagged something important and watched it disappear into a folder and not pushed back, not said anything, not put it back on the desk with the small act of insistence that might have changed the last 3 weeks. She looked at a spot on the wall just above Marcus's shoulder. Callaway scrolled through his phone. On the pale oak table between them, 22 pages sat in a manila folder, unopened. Page 3 was there. It had always been there. The numbers had always been there, patient, precise, indifferent to whether anyone looked at them or not, doing the quiet, relentless work of being true regardless of whether the most powerful person in the room had decided, before anyone spoke, that the truth being offered was not worth his time. Marcus clicked to slide 4, and the room, though it did not know it yet, was already beginning to change. He did not start with the conclusion. This was the first thing the room noticed, though most of them could not have articulated what they were noticing. Consultants, in Marcus's experience, always started with the conclusion. It was a performance instinct, lead with the number, the dramatic finding, the headline that justifies the fee. Build toward the problem from the solution, so the audience spends the whole presentation leaning slightly forward, waiting for the reveal they've already been promised. Marcus started with the system. He put up a slide that was, on its surface, not impressive. A flow diagram, blue boxes connected by gray lines, representing the movement of freight through Callaway's Southeast distribution network. 7 regional hubs, 42 subnodes. A transit matrix that, at first glance, looked like exactly what the company's own internal report said it was, functioning if not optimal. "This is what your network looks like from the outside," Marcus said. "This is also what it looks like from the inside, if you're reading the metrics your operations team is currently tracking. Everything appears within acceptable variance. The transit times are within benchmark. The cost per unit is elevated, but not alarmingly. The system looks, from every standard angle, like a system that is working." He paused. He clicked to the next slide. "It is not working." The slide showed the same network, except now there was a red line, thin, almost delicate, running through it, not connecting the obvious nodes, running between 2 points that had no direct operational relationship in the standard model: a mid-tier distribution hub in eastern Tennessee and a freight sorting facility in northern Georgia. 2 separate departments, 2 separate reporting structures, 2 separate sets of KPIs that were each individually performing adequately. He picked up the whiteboard marker. He turned to the whiteboard beside the screen, old-fashioned, deliberate, and he drew the red line again by hand slowly. Then he wrote 2 numbers beside it. The numbers represented the average time delay accumulating at the intersection of these 2 facilities each week. Not a dramatic number. Not a number that would make anyone in the room flinch on its own. Then he drew an arrow from that number to a second number. Then a third. He was building a chain, link by link, in plain marker on a white surface, showing the room how a small, invisible friction point at the junction of 2 poorly coordinated departments was generating a compounding inefficiency that rippled, quietly, patiently, invisibly, through 4 subsequent distribution stages before arriving, transformed and amplified, as a cost overrun that the company's financial reporting attributed to fuel and labor variance. It was not fuel. It was not labor. It was a conversation that 2 department heads were not having with each other because their KPIs didn't require it. $2.3 million per quarter, Marcus said. He wrote the number on the board. He underlined it once. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way he would tell Lily how much her school trip cost. Clearly without performance, because the number was real and reality didn't require embellishment. That is the quarterly cost of this single coordination gap. Annualized, you are losing between $9 and $9.5 million to a problem that does not require restructuring, does not require new technology, and does not require additional headcount. A board member, the younger one who had glanced at his legal pad during Calloway's dismissal, had stopped looking at his legal pad. He was looking at the whiteboard. His pen had been set down without his appearing to notice he had set it down. Another board member opened the manila folder. "The fix," Marcus continued, "is a protocol. A single, standardized weekly coordination checkpoint between these 2 facility managers, with a shared dashboard that tracks 4 specific metrics at their junction point. I have written the protocol. It is page 11 of your folders. Implementation timeline is 72 hours from authorization. The cost of implementation is effectively 0. He set the marker down. He looked at the room. Not at Calloway. At the room. At the board members who were now, without exception, either looking at the whiteboard or looking at page 11 of a folder that 20 minutes ago had been sitting untouched on a pale oak table. This was the thing about Marcus that no room ever expected. He did not perform confidence. He simply had no need for performance because the work was real. There is a specific kind of presence that comes from a person who is not trying to convince you of something but simply showing you something that is true. It is quieter than persuasion. It is also more powerful. Persuasion requires resistance to work against. Truth doesn't need resistance. It just needs to be seen. He had spent 30 evenings building this. After dinner and dishes and homework help and the bedtime negotiation that Lily always initiated from a position of far greater tactical sophistication than a 9-year-old should reasonably possess. After the nightlight went through its slow rotation and the apartment went quiet and the only sound was Gerald the radiator and the faint ambient noise of a city that didn't know his name. He had built this for $340. For a field trip. For a child who had put a yellow sun over a crack in a dashboard and seen it as decoration rather than damage. He had built it because it was true and because it was needed and because those had always been, for Marcus Hale, sufficient reasons. The board member who had opened the folder looked up. "Mr. Hale," he said carefully. "When did you identify this?" 3 weeks ago, Marcus said. It's on page 3. The board member's question hung in the air for a moment before the room absorbed it. 3 weeks ago. It's on page 3. No one moved immediately. The sentence had a weight to it. Not the dramatic weight of an accusation, but the quieter, more uncomfortable weight of an implication that everyone in the room was now doing the private arithmetic on. 3 weeks. The email. The folder. Page 3. Sitting on a pale oak table. Unopened. Calloway had not moved. Marcus noted this in his peripheral vision, not with satisfaction, not with anything as warm as vindication, but with the neutral, operational awareness of a man who had learned to read rooms the way he read systems. Calloway was still. Not the relaxed stillness of before. A different quality of stillness. The stillness of a man whose internal model of a situation has just developed a hairline fracture and who is, without showing it, running rapid calculations on the structural implications. The younger board member, his name was Stephen Park, Marcus would learn later, Chief Strategy Officer, 38 years old, the person in this room who still had enough professional humility to let something surprise him, had his folder fully open now. He was on page 3. He was reading. His expression was the expression of someone confirming something rather than discovering it. The particular focus of a person who suspected the answer before they found it and is now watching the suspicion solidify into certainty. Marcus continued. He walked through the final elements of his presentation with the same unhurried clarity he had maintained throughout. The implementation timeline, the monitoring framework, the projected recovery curve over the first 3 quarters post-correction. He answered 2 questions from a board member he recognized from the company's website as the CFO. Precise questions, the right questions, asked in the tone of someone doing rapid reconciliation between what they thought they knew and what they were being shown. He answered them directly. He did not editorialize. He did not reach for credit. He was on his final slide when his phone buzzed. It was face up on the table. He kept it face up always, out of a habit built over 6 years of being Lily's sole point of contact in a world full of small emergencies. The screen lit with a number he recognized. The main office line of Lily's school. He glanced at it. 1 second. Less than 1 second. The involuntary glance of a parent. The kind that bypasses decision-making entirely, routed directly from some ancient, preconscious part of the brain that had been rewired by the specific anxiety of raising a child alone in a world where you are one person and the school calls the main parent and you are the main parent and the only parent and the entire parental infrastructure condensed into a single phone that must always be within reach and always be answered. He silenced it. He returned his eyes to the board. No one in the room would have noticed except Denise, who noticed everything, and Stephen Park, who happened to be watching Marcus's face at that moment with the attentiveness of someone who had been recalibrating his assessment of a person in real time and was paying close attention to all available data. Marcus finished his final point. He clicked to his closing slide. The phone buzzed again. Same number. He silenced it again. Same motion. Quiet. Practiced. The motion of a man who has done this before, has had to hold 2 worlds simultaneously in the same body, has had to be fully present in a professional room while something in a different room, a smaller room, a room with a nightlight and a radiator named Gerald, exerts its constant quiet gravitational pull. Are there any other questions? He said. There were. Stephen Park had 2 more. The CFO had a follow-up. Marcus answered them. His voice was level. His hands were still on the table. His phone screen face up showed a 3rd call coming in. This time he looked at it for slightly longer. Not because he was going to answer it. He was not going to answer it. He knew, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a man who had learned to triage the simultaneous demands of his life, that whatever the school was calling about could wait 6 minutes, that Lily was in class and therefore not in danger, that the most likely reason for 3 consecutive calls from the school office was administrative rather than emergency. He knew this. And yet, there is a thing that happens to single parents in moments like this, a thing that has no clean name in professional language because professional language was not built with them in mind. It is not panic. It is not distraction. It is something more like a split, a sudden, visceral awareness of the distance between the room you are standing in and the room that actually matters, and the specific loneliness of being the only person who has to measure that distance and judge it and live with the judgment either way. Couples share this, the quick glance between 2 people, the silent negotiation, the you take it or I take it of parenting emergencies. Marcus took all of it. He silenced the 3rd call. He looked up at the room. And for just a moment, A fraction of a moment, the emotional equivalent of a single frame. Something passed across his face that was not composure. Not its absence either. Something between them. A flicker. The specific human expression of a person holding more than one thing at once and choosing, again, to hold both. Stephen Park saw it. He could not have named it, exactly. But he had a daughter of his own, 7 years old, 2 parents, a full house, and he recognized something in that flicker the way you recognize a word in a language you studied once and half forgot. He recognized the weight of it. The specific geometry of someone for whom the professional and the personal were not separate categories stored in separate compartments, but 2 threads of the same continuous responsibility, woven together so tightly that you could not pull one taut without the other feeling it. He said nothing. Marcus finished the presentation. He thanked the room. He left his folder on the table. He uncapped the USB drive and held it in his palm, waiting to see if anyone wanted to retain the files. It was Calloway who broke the silence that followed, not with a question about the presentation, not with the acknowledgement that the room's energy had been quietly and irrevocably restructured in the last 40 minutes, but with the territorial reflex of a man who needed to reclaim the axis of the room before it drifted too far from him. "Why didn't you flag this in your initial proposal?" Calloway said. 3 weeks ago? It was not quite a question. It was a challenge wrapped in a question's punctuation. A way of saying, if this is real, why wasn't it made impossible to ignore? A way of redistributing the discomfort of the last hour back toward the person who had caused it. The room waited. Marcus looked at him, not with triumph, not with the tightly controlled satisfaction of a man about to deliver a line he has been rehearsing, with something quieter than that. The expression of a person who has already let go of needing the answer to land a particular way, who has learned, through the specific curriculum of the last 6 years, that you can only offer the truth. You cannot make people receive it. You can only offer it clearly and without performance, and let it be what it is. "I did," Marcus said. He said it quietly, the way he said most things. It was on page 3. The subject line said urgent. The sentence landed without theater. That was the thing about it. The thing that made it stick to the walls of that room the way theatrical sentences never do. Theatrical sentences announce themselves. They arrive with a particular energy, a coiling before the strike, a register shift that tells the listener, pay attention, something is happening here. They give the target time to prepare a response, to build a small defensive position, to meet the blow with something that softens it. Marcus's sentence gave no warning. "I did." It was on page 3. The subject line said urgent. 12 words. Delivered at the same volume and cadence as everything else he had said in the last 40 minutes. No pause before it for effect. No breath held after it for drama. Simply, the answer to the question that had been asked, stated as plainly as the numbers on the whiteboard, and then the silence that followed because Marcus had said what was true in truth, once placed in a room, does not require its speaker to stay standing beside it and defend it. It simply exists. It waits. Stephen Park turned to page 3. He had already been there, had already read it during the presentation, but he turned back to it now, in the specific way that a person returns to evidence they have already processed but need to hold again in order to fully believe. He read the summary paragraph. He read the flagged metric. He looked at the date stamp at the top of the page. 3 weeks ago. He set the folder down without closing it. Across the table, the CFO had also opened to page 3. She read it with the compressed, rapid attention of someone who has just understood the shape of a situation and is moving quickly through its implications. Her expression did not change in the large, visible ways. It changed in the small ones, the slight tightening at the corners of her eyes, the almost imperceptible pause between one breath and the next. She looked at Calloway. Calloway was looking at the table, not at the folder, not at the whiteboard with its red line and its underline number. At the surface of the pale oak table, which offered nothing back, no data, no argument, no diplomatic framing that could reassemble the last 3 weeks into a shape that reflected better on the head of the table. Denise, by the credenza, had gone very still. She was looking at the middle distance with the focused vacancy of someone whose mind is working very fast and whose face has learned, through long professional practice, not to show it. She was thinking about the inbox, about the Tuesday review stack, about the folder called External Consultants, Pending and the email she had flagged and the 9 minutes and the sliding gesture and the pale oak table and the unopened folder and the 12 words that were now in the room and would not be leaving. She was thinking about all of it, and none of it showed on her face, and she looked at a spot on the wall and held herself very still. The silence lasted longer than silences usually last in boardrooms, which are professionally allergic to silence. Rooms built on the metabolism of decisive people who experience pause as inefficiency and fill it reflexively with language, with action, with the constant forward motion of institutional will. Nobody filled it. Stephen Park spoke first. Not to Calloway, to Marcus. "I'd like to schedule a follow-up," he said, "to discuss phased implementation. This week, if possible." The CFO nodded, a single, precise movement. "I'll want to loop in operations leadership. Can you present this same analysis for the full operations team?" "Yes," Marcus said. Then Calloway moved. Not dramatically. Not with the visible effort of a man executing a reversal under duress, though that was what it was. With the practiced, controlled fluency of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms like this one and knew how to walk back into the center of a situation without appearing to have ever left it. He set his phone face down on the table, the genuine version this time, not the ration patient's version from earlier. He folded his hands. He looked at Marcus. "What is your current day rate?" he asked. The question was clean, professional, stripped of anything that would acknowledge the distance between how this meeting had begun and where it now stood. Calloway was not a man who apologized in boardrooms, possibly not anywhere. But he was a man who understood value, and the thing about value was that it did not require his feelings about it to be real. The number on the whiteboard was real. Page 3 was real. 72 hours to implementation was real. Marcus told him his rate. It was a fair number, calibrated, as all of Marcus's professional calculations were, to what the work was actually worth rather than to what the market would bear if pushed. He had never been good at the theater of negotiation, the strategic pause, the counter, the managed scarcity. He named what the work was worth and he meant it and he let the number stand. Calloway approved it. No counter. No pause. No managed scarcity applied in the other direction. No testing of whether Marcus could be moved. He said fine in the tone of someone closing a line item and moved directly to logistics, timeline, deliverables, point of contact. Denise, 6 years into her tenure, had never once seen him fail to negotiate a rate. She wrote down the number in her notebook. She wrote it very carefully, as if she understood, as she did understand, because Denise understood most things that happened in that room even when she gave no sign of it, that this number was not just a number. It was a small, wordless, entirely insufficient acknowledgement that something which had been dismissed had turned out to be worth considerably more than 9 minutes. She wrote it down, and then she turned the page. He took the elevator down alone. The meeting had run 47 minutes. Not 9. Not 90. 47, which felt, to Marcus, like exactly the right amount of time. Enough to say what needed to be said. Not so much that the room had time to overcorrect in the other direction and make the whole thing feel like a reckoning. He did not want a reckoning. He had never wanted a reckoning. He had wanted, as he always wanted, to fix something broken and go home. The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides. He stood in it and looked at himself without particular interest. The navy blazer, the clean shoes, the manila folder now empty of all copies save the one he had left on the table. He looked like a man who had done a day's work. That was all. That was enough. The lobby was marble and high-ceilinged and designed, like the hallway above it, to make people feel the weight of the institution they were entering or leaving. Marcus walked across it at his usual pace. Unhurried, unperformative. Pushed through the glass door and stepped into the morning. The city was fully awake now. The parking garage was across the street and half a block down. He walked toward it with his folder under his arm and the USB drive in his jacket pocket and the particular quality of tiredness that comes not from exertion but from sustained precision. The tiredness of a mind that has been working very carefully for a long time and is now, in the open air, beginning to release. He found his Camry on level 2. Unlocked it. Sat down. He did not start the engine. He sat for a moment in the specific silence of a parked car, the sealed, private silence of a small space that belongs entirely to you, where the city outside is visible through glass but temporarily, blessedly uninvolved. He set his folder on the passenger seat. He put the USB drive in the cup holder. He put his hands on the steering wheel without gripping it. Then he picked up his phone. 3 missed calls from the school. 1 voicemail. He played the voicemail on speaker, his thumb pressed to the home button, his eyes on the concrete column directly in front of the car. "Hi, this is Janet calling from the main office at Riverside Elementary. This is a reminder call for parents regarding the Washington, D.C. trip payment. Today is the final day to submit the deposit and we haven't received Lily Hales yet. The deadline is noon today. Please call us back or submit online as soon as possible. Thank you so much." He looked at the time on the dashboard. 11:43. 17 minutes. He opened his banking app. His balance was what it had been this morning, $290. The deposit was $340. He had the day rate he had just been approved for, but contracts took time to process and the check would not arrive before noon on a Tuesday, no matter what Richard Calloway had signed off on in a boardroom on the 34th floor. He sat with this for a moment. Not in despair, he was past the age and the circumstance where this particular quality of shortfall produced despair. In the early years, before he had built his consulting practice into something that mostly held, before Lily was old enough for school trips to have dollar amounts attached to them, there had been months that produced real despair, the kind with physical weight, the kind that made the drive home feel longer than it was. He was past that. But the 17 minutes and the $50 gap and the field trip that Lily had talked about every day for 2 weeks, that she had drawn on the refrigerator with a small pencil sketch of the Washington Monument that looked more like a very thin birthday cake. This had its own particular sting. He called the school. Janet answered on the second ring. "Hi, this is Marcus Hale, Lily's father. I got your messages. I'm $50 short of the deposit right now, but I have a contract I just signed this morning. Is there any flexibility on the deadline or a payment plan?" "Mr. Hale," Janet said, and her voice was the voice of a person who fields calls like this one regularly and has long since learned how to hold both the policy and the human being at once. "Actually, let me check something." A pause. Keyboard sounds. "It looks like someone submitted an anonymous partial payment to Lily's account this morning. She has $290 on file. If you can cover the remaining $50, she's confirmed." Marcus said nothing for a moment. "An anonymous payment," he said. "Yes, sir. It came through online, no name attached." He thought about this. He turned it over. He would never know with certainty, would never ask, and would receive no answer if he did. But he thought about Denise, who had been at the credenza, who had his contact information from the meeting logistics, who had been in that room for 6 years watching things get dismissed, who had looked at a spot on the wall and written down a number very carefully and then turned the page. He would never know. "I'll send the 50 now," he said. He paid it from his phone, sitting in the parking garage, and listened to Janet confirm that Lily Hale was on the list for the Washington, D.C. trip departing in 3 weeks. He thanked her. He ended the call. He sat for another moment. Outside the garage, the city moved in its ordinary way. Traffic and pigeons and the distant horn of something impatient and the specific quality of late morning urban light that falls differently than morning light, less provisional, more committed to the day. He sat inside it and felt, without examining it too closely, the thing that had settled in his chest since the boardroom. It was not triumph. He had felt triumph before, and this was not the texture of it. Triumph has an edge to it, a forward momentum, a desire to be witnessed. This was something rounder, something that did not require an audience. It was the feeling of a thing being recognized after long invisibility. Not celebrated, not compensated, simply seen. The specific quiet warmth of having been in a room that did not expect you, and having offered what you had, and having it turn out to be exactly what was needed, and leaving the room before anyone started treating you differently. He started the engine. The Camry hummed. The crack in the dashboard ran its familiar line from the defroster vent to the corner of the windshield, old and settled, structural in its own minor way. Over it, slightly off-center, the yellow sun sticker. Small, cheerful, placed there on a Sunday afternoon by a 9-year-old who had found the crack while sitting in the front seat and declared it sad and gone inside to fix it without being asked. He drove. He picked Lily up at 3:15 from the carpool line, which was run with the specific iron efficiency of a woman named Mrs. Petrakis who had been doing it for 11 years and brooked no double parking. Lily came through the glass doors with her backpack hanging off one shoulder, and her hair escaping its morning braid, and a piece of paper in her hand that she was already holding out to him before she reached the car. "I got a 93 on my science test," she said, climbing in. Mrs. Alvarez said it was the best explanation of the water cycle in the class. "I know," Marcus said. "I read your draft 4 times. You said it was good. I said it was almost good. You fixed the almost." She put her seatbelt on with the satisfied air of someone whose position has been vindicated and settled her backpack on her lap. Then, in the way of 9-year-olds transitioning between topics without ceremony, "How was your meeting?" "Fine," he said. Someone finally read the report. She looked at him for a moment in the particular way she had, the steady, undecorated way of someone who understood more than she was given credit for and had long since decided not to perform the not understanding. "Good," she said, as if this had always been the expected outcome, as if the alternative had never, in her assessment of her father, been seriously on the table. She turned to look out the window. Marcus pulled out of the carpool line. The city moved around them. The afternoon was warm. On the dashboard, between the crack and the windshield, the yellow sun sticker caught the light and held it, small and certain and exactly where she had put it. Some things, placed by the right hands, stay.